All right, so yeah, I wanted to talk about these three ideas. There's also some discussion of decapitation. So there aren't too many gruesome images, but just to warn you, well, it's fine. I mean, there are lots more horrible images I could have used, but I tried not to. But feel free to leave. I mean, they're mostly artistic and illustrative versions of this concept. Anyway. Okay, so I wanted to think about these three terms and to try to come to some sort of conceptual definitions of what they might mean and how they might help us to think sort of spatially and pragmatically about our response to capitalism. So I'm interested in two main things today, one of which is how we think about toppling, that is to say, cutting the head off of both the state and capitalism, and trying to think those two things together, and the sort of intimate and intricate links between the state and capital, which obviously I can't really analyse in any great detail, but to just frame the problem in that way. And two, how we best take up the discussion of this project in relation to current debates in and about the left today regarding how we conceive capitalism and what our strategy might be. And obviously this is in the broader framework of thinking about the relationship between the ruling class, whether we conceive of the ruling class as a kind of a bearer of capital, or whether we conceive of them as a group of individuals, how we conceive of that kind of group. And it's increasingly my conviction that, well, not just my conviction, in a way that the ruling class kind of seeks to hide constantly. It hides its assets, its resources, and also its desire. And so I'm interested in how we might expose the ruling class in a certain way. I mean, obviously, we can also talk about the visibility of the ruling class as well in certain kind of grotesque ways. I mean, what does it mean to have this Trump administration in America, for example? But partly my sort of theoretical response comes as a critical response to the accelerationist project, which has become this kind of amorphous beast in many ways. But in the manifesto from a few years ago now, where they claim that today's politics is beset by an inability to generate the new ideas and modes of organisation necessary to transform our societies, to confront and resolve the coming annihilations. And they say in the manifesto, this is Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams, but there are many other people associated, I suppose, with this project in one way or another. They say that we need a Promethean politics of maximal mastery over society and its environment that is capable of either dealing with global problems or achieving victory over capital. Okay, so that's from their manifesto. What I'm proposing instead of the accelerationist project is an idea of decapitalism, which is linguistically and conceptually a little bit like Ivan Illich's idea of deschooling and this idea of undoing the kind of damage that a certain kind of capitalist education inculcates, but also perhaps similar to something like decolonization and the kind of decolonial projects that we've seen many of in recent years. The point, I think, for me is to take back what is left, along with the technologies that have contributed to despoliation and exploitation, and turn them back against this same destruction. This does not depend upon a going through capitalism to get to the other side, which I think is what's going on in the accelerationist project, but rather involves cutting off the heads of those who control technology, decapitating capitalism, as it were. Okay, so this proposed redistribution of an already highly advanced series of technologies, industrial, communicative, and medical, does not imply, I hope, some kind of neo-Luddism, but rather a recognition of what resources already exist and a mapping of production, consumption, and the amount of time it would take, for example, to clean polluted waters or to distribute food adequately. This project of decapitalism is not then a call for slowing down, although it might involve that, against this kind of fetishization of speed and acceleration, but rather a beginning with the recognition of the damage and depletion that has been done and continues to be done, without lapsing into a fatalist despair or a desire to fuse with the machine, to fuse with capitalism and technology, and somehow come out the other side as what. So I'm very wary and suspicious of, I guess, certain kinds of very technophiliac fantasies, many of which are circulating at the moment. This version of decapitalism I'm describing starts by recognizing that which is often hidden in plain sight, but without which systems, both capitalist and communist, would fall apart. So one of these things is human labour, and particularly those forms of labour that cannot be automated, such as care work. And there's the feminist work on this over the last sort of 30 or 40 years is absolutely central to this project. And I think there's a fundamental problem with this call for full automation, in the sense that it's just not true. It's not possible in certain ways. We can automate many things, but we cannot automate care work in the final instance. We can discuss this later, perhaps. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about images of anti-capitalism. So this is an image from Alan Sekula's Waiting for the Tear Gas from 1999 to 2000. And I think the way we sort of think about anti-capitalism is maybe in relation to things like the Battle of Seattle, so a kind of anti-globalization, a kind of direct confrontation with the state. We can think about it in relation to this model, The Four Strategic Logics of Anti-Capitalism by Eric Olin Wright, where he looks at the kind of different aspects, I suppose, of anti-capitalism. Anti-capitalism, in many ways, is an enormously appealing project, but there are kind of possible limitations in terms of whether anti-capitalism, in a sense, plays into the same logic. Is it always going to depend upon that which it opposes, and so on? Can we tame capitalism? Can we smash capitalism? Can we escape capitalism? Can we erode capitalism? And I wonder if there's a question about how we date these different concepts, whether anti-capitalism is still the same kind of project as it was perhaps in the 90s and the early 2000s. Or perhaps something has shifted. We can think about anti-capitalism as a kind of mirror. So think about the kind of tactics. This is from a Black Lives Matter protest recently, where you hold up a mirror to the state. So you hold up a mirror to the violence of the state and reflect it back to the officers, to the police, and thinking about that in terms of a spatial confrontation, right? Does anti-capitalism always require this kind of logic of visibility and presence? Is the site of anti-capitalism primarily the streets? And then, in a sense, the question becomes who or what is hidden behind that confrontation. And of course, anti-capitalism in this confrontational sense is always both a criticism of the state and of capitalism in most instances. As Olin Wright puts it, anti-capitalism is possible not simply as a moral stance towards the harms and injustices of global capitalism, but as a practical stance towards building an alternative for greater human flourishing. But if we stick with this idea of the mirror in the anti-capitalist protest, there's a sense in which the mirror of the protesters understands state violence, as well as the fact that there are men in suits hiding behind the men in riot gear. So here, anti-capitalism and anti-state oppression are not in opposition in terms of a diagnosis and an opposition to that situation. Yet by necessity, street action becomes tied up with this immediate conflict. And we see this particularly in the case of riots as well, where the state's response is kind of instantaneous. So in the 2011 riots in England, there were 24-hour courts. People were sent away immediately. There was a kind of huge mobilization of the state against those involved. Something like the Black Lives Matter protests are very, very interesting and important in this regard, and more recent than the riots, because, in a sense, lots of the actions are a sort of direct attempt to stop the reproduction of the everyday. So when the highways are closed, the airports are closed, and shopping malls are closed, there is a sense in which, because it's the everyday that reproduces structural racism, that reproduces structural violence, that reproduces the police, you have to kind of cut the arteries of that reproduction off. And in that sense, it's not simply symbolic protests, although the die-ins have a long tradition going back to the AIDS activism and so on. But it's also like this direct action, like the recognition that you need to stop the flows of capital in order to stop the reproduction of violence. So there is something very profound, I think, that links Black Lives Matter both to an anti-capitalist struggle and to a longer anti-racist struggle. I want to go back a few years, quite a few years, to the middle of the 17th century. I think because one of the things I want to stress is the role of the state. I think it's very easy to think that we are post-state in some ways. I think, as mentioned in the introduction, the idea that somehow global capital, multinationals and so on have transcended the need for national borders. I mean, we can blatantly see that this isn't the case in terms of, ever-increasing restrictions on movements, ever-increasing racist and structural blocking of people and the treatment of refugees, asylum seekers and immigrants. And I want to, I suppose, stress the centrality of state violence and actually the increase in state violence. So even where the state privatizes certain of its practices, like when it privatizes security and so on, in the last instance, those private firms will always be backed up by the state. So I think we shouldn't be misled into thinking that the penetration of capital into securitization and privatization doesn't mean that this is not still a state project. So I want to look at this very famous frontispiece, two versions of it, from Hobbes's Leviathan from 1651. Agamben looks at these two images in Stasis, his recent text. So there are two different versions of this. In the manuscript prepared for the king, for Charles II, the tiny men that make up the body of the Leviathan were turned outwards, in fact it's this image, towards the monarch. Whereas in the single copy for the sovereign, he gets the one where the little faces, the multitude, are turned towards him, right? Because he is, in a sense, the Leviathan, he's the king. In the usual edition, the edition that everyone else read, if they could read, which wasn't very many people, then you have them facing up towards the head of the sovereign. Okay, so it's the same people, but in one sense they're looking at the king, in the other they're looking towards the king. So you've got multiple kings here. Pointing out that the Leviathan in the image appears behind the earth in both versions, or behind the city. So the Leviathan is sort of standing above there with a sword. Agamben notes that the mortal god, as Hobbes puts it, does not then reside in the city, but outside it, in a kind of no man's land. He says the commonwealth, the body political, does not coincide with the physical body of the city. And I think there's something also very important about the sword, and this will relate to some of my claims about decapitation in a minute. So I think these two frontispieces may be 366 years old, but I think there are at least two things that it might tell us. One, that we should never be too hasty to give up on ideas of sovereignty in the state, for reasons I've already outlined, even when platform and techno-capitalism seem to present us with modes of horizontalism and globalism that we should replicate or should, understand. I mean, of course, we should understand them, but without forgetting, I think, sovereignty in the states. And two, that states are fundamentally repressive, and the more and more the state erodes its kind of welfare elements, the more it becomes simply a repressive apparatus. So when things like education and health and anything with a public quality is taken away, as it is increasingly in many countries, Britain is particularly great at destroying everything like that. Then all we are left with, in a sense, is a repressive state. And I think we should be very, very clear to know that, to understand that. And the way in which the state then operates is very asymmetrical in terms of its population. There are some people for whom the state can be seen at a distance, and there are some for whom they have no choice but to be confronted with the state all the time. So in the accelerationist case, Cernicek and Williams seem to think that the left has failed politically because it wants to remain, as they put it, local, as opposed to looking at the vast resources and actions of the state in the curbing of political activity. Right? I think that they don't understand how much effort goes into the state repression of anyone doing anything. And if you look at the undercover policing in England and Britain, and various things, you know, the amount of money and time and effort that is put into actually preventing any form of opposition, I think we should start there rather than blaming the left for being local, as they put it. I think, in a sense, that the accelerationist critique of the left is actually itself slightly out of date. It's a historically displaced model, that what they are attacking are perhaps this image of anti-capitalism. Yes, the kind of 1999 Seattle WTO protest, the Battle of Seattle, and so on. I think the question now perhaps hinges on whether we think that capitalism will collapse on its own or whether we need to behead it. Okay, and I'm clearly going for the latter option. There's a question of how we conceive capitalism, whether we conceive it spatially, as in Hobbes's Leviathan, as a fusion of sovereign power and financial violence, so the kind of sovereign in the political and the economic sense, or as the violence of finance, what Badiou today calls capitalo-parliamentarism, which he thinks we live under the regime of capitalo-parliamentarism, which is this fusion of capital and the state. And there's an interesting question posed by Wolfgang Streeck in his 2014 paper, How Will Capitalism End? And he says, capitalism as a social order held together by a promise of boundless collective progress is in critical condition. Growth is giving way to secular stagnation. What economic progress remains is less and less shared, and confidence in the capitalist money economy is leveraged on a rising mountain of promises that are ever less likely to be kept. And he goes on to explain how he thinks, in a sense, because of these kind of cumulative crises, that capital is increasingly fragile. Okay, so he does talk about this, the way in which states then step in to kind of bail out and print money and do all these things that we have seen. So we don't have a pure capitalism. We have seen a kind of fusion of a nation-state saving of capital as well as capital itself. So he talks about these 5 worsening disorders for which no cure is at hand. He says, declining growth, oligarchy, starvation of the public sphere, corruption and international anarchy. He says, what is to be expected on the basis of capitalism's recent historical record is a long and painful period of cumulative decay. And he worries that we are looking back to the 1930s, and we can think about what that means politically as well. So the other term I wanted to briefly outline is this idea of postcapitalism, which I think is well summed up in this very interesting image by the Deterritorial Support Group from 2011, who are a very interesting design collective, no longer existing in this format. And I guess it's associated with thinkers like Paul Mason, who in 2015 talks about a kind of at the end of capitalism. Okay, not quite in the same terms as Streeck, but perhaps thinking about what might come next. He says that the historical subject he will bring post-capitalism is the networked individual. Okay, this is Mason's conjecture. He says, we all participate in the creation of brands, in the creation of consumption choices. We are fueling financial capitalism through our use of finance. So he says, I buy the idea that there is a social factory. You pursue the interests of those network individuals, which is for their information not to be stolen from them, their information not to be arbitrarily accessed by the state, their lifestyles to be allowed to flourish, for them to have choices. Okay, it seems to me, from Mason's comments, that he buys too much into this idea of this we as consumers, first and foremost consumers. And in his description of the shift from the white working class, which he talks about the death of, to the networked individuals, seems to me very, very highly geographically gender-specific and race-specific trajectory, which is not, in any sense, a kind of global perspective. So, how much time do I have? 9 minutes. Shit. Okay. All right. I'll try and rush through this. Hang on. Okay, so decapitalism. Right, this is my sort of speculative other thing. Okay. Right, well, this image is interesting. This is from 2016. Clearly this person had been reading my work, no. This is from a strike in Paris in May last year, which is a strike by French railway and port workers under Hollande, and it's against the kind of labour law, labour reforms under Hollande. And I thought it was a very interesting image, the guy with the bucket on his head, and so on. Here we have another very trashy cartoon, which someone drew as an image against Scott Walker in Wisconsin, pointing out that these kind of Republicans are not interested, in fact, in creating new jobs in poorer parts of the country, but are in fact decapitating the workers. I thought this was interesting. Okay, I'm interested in what cannot be thought, of what is too shocking to mention or to contemplate. And I think beheading or decapitating is still one of those things. If you think about the almost like the edicts against the representation and the presentation of beheadings and decapitation, we understand that there are still some things that have an implicit politics of the image or an ethics of the image around them. And for that reason, I'm not going to show any clips or stills from any of the ISIS beheading videos about which there is much discussion, of course. And today, I don't think it's coincidental that we most associate, perhaps in recent years, beheading or decapitation with this image of ISIS. We should remember that most of the beheadings, the high-profile ones, are often of Westerners or Western converts, but most of the people that they behead are Muslim too. We might think of these videos then, and we might also think back to the guillotine if we're starting to think about the politics of beheading. Beheading has an extremely complex political and religious history. It's an act of war. It's an act of, in some sense, also a way of recognizing nobility. In a strange way. So when various forms of beheading were used in the after the Middle Ages, it was often nobles and kings that were executed, and queens, famously, in this way, because it was felt to be a more honourable way to kill somebody. Saudi Arabia is the only nation now that continues to make regular and official use of decapitation, though it's still on the books in various other countries. But in Western countries, court-sanctioned beheadings continued well into the 20th century. So the last person to be decapitated in Sweden was in 1910, the last German was in 1949, and the last guillotine in France took place in 1977, although the possibility remained on the books until 1981 in France. I think it's very clear, as Ibrahim al-Marashi points out, that Western media outlets will not show the actual video of the moment of beheading in the ISIS videos. Nevertheless, the act of beheading generates a storm of debate. He talks about the use of these videos as a form of terror marketing, as a way of a kind of pornography of decapitation. You can obviously access these videos easily anyway, even if they're not shown on national media. Also as a form of capital punishment, and we might want to reread and reuse the phrase capital punishment to think about the punishment of capital. And as al-Marashi puts it, they communicate, these videos, both vengeance, justice to its citizens, and at the same time instill fear into those citizens, which even include the most die-hard ISIS foot soldier. And I want to, in 2 minutes, go through very brief prehistory of decapitation and the fear that it inculcates. I know, seriously. Come on. All right. I've only got like 3-4 slides. Okay. So, well, all right. So this is obviously Medusa. Very terrifying. So Freud in 1922 wrote a couple of pages on the Medusa's head, and he says this: "To decapitate equals to castrate." Just that sentence at the beginning. The terror of Medusa, he says, is thus a terror of castration that is linked to the sight of something. Numerous analyses have made us familiar with the occasion for this. It occurs when a boy who has hitherto been unwilling to believe the threat of castration catches sight of the female genitals, probably those of an adult, surrounded by hair, and essentially those of his mother. So there you go. That's the terrifying power of Medusa to castrate. Hélène Cixous, in 1981, in an essay called Castration or Decapitation, turns Freud's analysis around slightly, and she writes, "It's hard to imagine a more perfect example of a particular relationship between two economies, a masculine economy and a feminine economy, in which the masculine is governed by a rule that keeps time with 2 beats, 3 beats, 4 beats, with pipe and drum exactly as it should be, an order that works by inculcation, by education. It's always a question of education, an education that consists of trying to make a soldier of the feminine by force, the force history keeps reserved for women, the capital force that is effectively decapitation. Women have no choice other than to be decapitated. The moral is that if they don't actually lose their heads by the sword, they only keep them on condition that they lose them, that is, to complete silence, turned into automatons." So this is Cixous' very interesting kind of détournement of Freud, and talking about, in a sense, decapitation, not as the male masculine fear of castration, but as the very real lived castration of women in terms of being speaking beings. And I think this image, which you might know a bit about, is obviously... the Medusa was by Caravaggio, I should have mentioned, from 1595. This is by Gentileschi from 1614, 1620. It's Judith slaying Holofernes. There's Judith and her maid decapitating Holofernes as he lies drunkenly. So Judith is trying to liberate Israel, and she is a kind of heroine in the Apocrypha in that tradition. But the story about the painter is very important as well. Gentileschi was a few years before this, was raped when she was 18 by Tassi, who was her art teacher, who was asked to teach her perspective. And she, after this, there was a trial, and the bloke, who was horrific, went to prison for a year, but her reputation was kind of ruined. Just as Judith in the Apocrypha was never allowed to marry after this act. And Gentileschi produces a series of very violent images of powerful women committing violent acts of revenge and retribution. So Judith here had tricked Holofernes into by seducing him, such that she was allowed into his tent so that she could decapitate him. All right, just very, very, very quickly then. Obviously, then we have the guillotine, and this is actually a guillotine in Algeria, which was used by the French to murder prisoners. This is from 1899. So obviously guillotine was a French physician, but the guillotine has actually been in use since 1210. Victor Hugo described it as a kind of monster created by the judge and the craftsman. In 1792, Robespierre in a letter wrote, "Our revolution has made me feel the full force of the axiom that history is fiction, and I am convinced that chance and intrigue have produced more heroes than genius and virtue." I'm very interested in this line of the axiom that history is fiction, and obviously Robespierre's fate was to be guillotined too. So just on a kind of more positive note, I suppose, finally, is to think about other images of decapitation and maybe the impossibility of decapitation. I should note, as a side note, we can also dig up bodies and decapitate them afterwards. And this was the fate of Oliver Cromwell, famously, whose body was dug up by many years after he was killed. I don't know why it's funny. And then his head was severed and put on a spike. And it's still somewhere around. I know they buried it eventually, but it was like paraded around for centuries as a sort of weird talisman or whatever. Anyway, so that might be an idea of thinking about zombie capitalism. How do we to decapitate something which already seems to be dead? You know, whether we think the capital is already on the way out or not. I don't necessarily think it is. But here's the many-headed Hydra, and this, I suppose I'll just finish with this idea from Peter Linebaugh, who looks at the way in which the Hydra, so the classically educated architects of the Atlantic slave economy, were obsessed by Hercules and these labours of Hercules. And so one of them, of course, is the labour of killing the many-headed Hydra. So these architects of the slave trade and the slave economy would use this image of the Hydra to describe disorder and resistance. They used it to refer to the difficulty of imposing order on increasingly global systems of labour. They variously designated dispossessed commoners, transported felons, indentured servants, religious radicals, pirates, urban labourers, soldiers, sailors, and African slaves as the numerous ever-changing heads of the monster. So in a sense, it's about the impossibility of decapitation, not the impossibility of decapitating the sovereign, who in a sense it might be worth thinking about tends to only have one head, after all, but the impossibility of decapitating the many heads of the opposition, of resistance, and in all of its different forms. So I suppose I want to just, in a sense, the two images then would be this, the many-headed Hydra, and then back to this image then of the sovereign, the state, but not just the state, the state in capital, the state as capital, capital as the state, the relationship between those two, and how we might need many, many heads and many forms of analysis, whether they be psychoanalytic, feminist, anti-racist, and so on, in order to kind of defeat, the people who imagine that they are Hercules. Okay.